welcome. Welcome to this MAD panel. Today we host a conversation on Yemen, trying to reflect upon all the sides of this conflict. A conflict which is obviously military, political, but also economic, and also with a regional layer. With this purpose, we can't separate our analysis from the evolution of regional balances in the Gulf, including the international implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The external level matters a lot, although the Yemen war is, first of all, an internal fight with huge humanitarian consequences. I'm Eleonora Ardemagni, Associate Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and this webinar is part of its three online initiatives in the framework of MED, Mediterranean Dialogues 2022, the annual high-level conference promoted by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and ISPI. Glad to introduce our panelists, who really are three distinguished experts on Yemen and the Gulf region. So my warm welcome to Nadwa Al-Dawsari, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington with an outstanding experience in Yemen, especially on tribal dynamics, mediation, and peace building. Welcome to Ahmed Naji, non-resident scholar at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, a researcher, prolific researcher of political military issues, especially in the southern regions of Yemen, and also on border relations. And welcome to Sanam Vakil, Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House in London, where she leads project work on Iran and the Gulf monarchies with particular regard to Gulf security. As you know, this is an interactive panel, so I invite you to submit your questions for the panelists through the QA function of the platform, and we'll collect them, the most interesting of them, for the second part of the webinar. I firmly believe it's always the right time to talk about Yemen, but this is really a timely moment for having this conversation. And not only because the conflict has just turned 7. First of all, since the beginning of April, Yemen's warring parties are observing a nationwide truce after the mediation of the United Nations. Moreover, the interim president Hadi has just transferred his powers and also those of his powerful deputy General Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmar to a newly appointed presidential council, an 8-member body aiming to unite the highly fragmented political and military camp who opposes the Houthis. These Yemen events occur in a regional landscape which is still marked by uncertainty, thanks to the relaunch on the brink again, I would say, of the nuclear deal with Iran, but also in a context of shocking international crisis and polarization after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For Yemen, the war in Ukraine have also economic and humanitarian implications. Think that Yemen imports more than 1/3 of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia. But the fallout of this international crisis is also diplomatic, since the tensions between Western capitals and Moscow are testing Gulf powers' foreign policies, including on Yemen. Especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are trying to navigate between the traditional American-centered world order, which guaranteed their security in the past, and the rising, economy-driven and Eastern-oriented multipolar reality. Nadwa, I would start with you. The United Nations have recently defined the situation in Yemen a chronic emergency. Which are the humanitarian priorities after 7 years of conflict? And do you think this nationwide truce can be the occasion for starting to address these humanitarian and economic needs? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleonora, and thank you for the Italian Institute for having me. It's really a pleasure to share this panel with two really, really distinguished Yemen experts. To answer your question, yes, this has been a massive humanitarian disaster. Not only the priorities are big, not only in terms of food. Food is available in abundance in Yemen. The problem is that people cannot afford to buy it. Delivery of food aid is important and should continue to happen to save lives. But sadly, food aid, there has been massive corruption in food aid. There's been reports that it's even been diverted to fuel the war. So what is needed, I think the major need is to help people have the means to buy the food from the local market. Again, the food is available. I think what should happen is first of all is stabilizing the Yemeni riyal. The devaluation of the Yemeni riyal has has had devastating impact on households in Yemen. The prices of the food, basic foods, increased 10 times more. The other priority is the salary payment. Government employees, including teachers, health workers, which are a significant portion of government employees, both in the north and in the south, but particularly in the north, have not received salaries since mid-2016. Also, what is important is access. I'm very glad that the Sana'a airport is going to reopen. It should not have been closed in the first place. But on the ground, also roads between cities have to be open so that people and goods don't have to take an entire day or 2 days to reach their destination, as opposed to like a few hours. The siege on Ta'a city must end. Also, easing the fuel entry into Hodeida seaport is a good thing. Another priority is resolving the conflict between the Houthis and the Yemeni government on the central bank. I hope this will happen. The split of the central bank between Sana'a and Aden has deepened the economic crisis in the country. The current truce can be an opportunity to resolve all these issues, and I hope the conflict parties will make this a priority and set their differences aside to resolve these economic and humanitarian issues. I just hope it happens.
Thank you, Nadwa. You rightly mentioned the issue of the central bank, and this highlights how much also the should be independent institutions of Yemen were shattered, divided by the war, and with the split between the Sana'a central bank controlled by the Houthis and the Aden relocated branch of the internationally recognized central bank. Thank you very much for this framework. Ahmed, let's talk about military and political balances in Yemen today. In 2021, the Houthis advanced militarily in strategic governorates such as Marib, and to a lesser extent also in Shabwa, governorates which are rich in energy resources. These military offensives were contained on the ground mostly due to the deployment of the UAE-backed giant brigades from the western coast. Security conditions in Hodeida have also deteriorated despite the Stockholm Agreement. So how would you describe Yemen's military political balances today? And in your view, does the newly appointed Presidential Council represent the variety of the Yemeni players who are fighting the Houthis? Most of all, can all these players coexist in a single entity? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the panel and for this question specifically, because it highlights many dynamics in the Yemeni context. And to answer the question, let me start with let me name it a tipping point in 2019, in 2021, in September specifically, when the Houthis advanced in Shabwa and took over Bayhan, Usaylan, and Ain districts, beside other districts also in Marib. And this move was alarming, actually, for so many observers, for regional actors, because most of the narratives that moment was saying that, yeah, the Houthis will just control, the northern areas, and they will not move to the southern parts. And for the Houthi, and from the Houthi perspective, it's useless to just take over Marib and not move to what's behind Marib, because having controlling all these oil-rich areas, they need to be taken as a one package. So as I mentioned, that this move from the Houthi side was an alarming for the Saudi-led coalition. And we have seen so many arrangements after this move. The Saudis and Emiratis thought that, unifying their agenda in Yemen is a must, because having different strategies in the country will not serve any country, none of them, because this is actually the problem that Yemen was witnessing, either between this kind of different agendas between the UAE and Saudis, or their proxies on the ground. So on the ground, we have seen redeployment of the Giants brigades from the western coast, and they were shifted to Shabwa and left the coastline for the Houthis. And that moment, there was actually sort of conviction within the Saudi-led coalition. This front in the west coast was kind of a dead front, especially after Stockholm Agreement. And there's no point actually for seeing so many forces in these areas without, any possibility to move towards Hodeida. So shifting the Giants brigades to Shabwa was, a significant move done by the Saudi-led coalition and their local, actors, the STC and the other governmental forces, beside the tribal forces. And soon after arriving Shabwa, the Giants brigade started, military operations against the Houthis, and within 2 weeks they managed to restore Bayhan, Ain, and Usaylan, and move towards Marib. And at this moment, we saw actually a new development where the Houthis targeted for the first time Abu Dhabi, and they targeted oil facilities there. And this was a key threat for the UAE. They thought that, the war comes home, the war comes home, and they need actually to come up with a new strategy to contain it. And yes, the Shabwa battle stopped at some point. And on the other side, we have seen also, as a result of the Shabwa battle, the governmental forces, as long as the tribal forces managed to push the Houthis from so many strategic areas near Marib city. And we have also seen some sort of not complete stop, but at least, the escalation be de-escalated a little bit in these areas. But the arrangements within the Saudi-led coalition continued, and we have seen so many consultations between them. And later on, we have seen also the GCC-sponsored Yemeni talks, which was aimed actually to unify the Yemeni local voices to be in the line of the new strategy of the Saudi-led coalition. Because at this moment, the Saudi-led coalition seeing the war in Yemen as a key threat, and they need actually to count on a new approach where they end the conflict and they manage their agendas through different tools. Of course, I mean, with this strategy, Hadi was no longer the right person to be in the office, and especially he became a very weak person. His health condition was worse. He left actually a huge political vacuum because of his inability, and as a result, actually he ended up with this kind of delegation his power to a new presidential council, and he had the realistic approach of the Saudi-led coalition. Let's bring all the local or active local actors to be a part of one unified presidential council in order to manage the new face of Yemen. And this is all within the anti-Houthi bloc. This is actually important to mention. Of course, the political presidential council or the presidential council is an important step, at least to have this kind of movement within the Yemeni conflict trajectory. But at the same time, it has so many challenges. And the question of whether this council will succeed or will be a new model of failure depend on three points in my perspective. And I will mention these points and I will end here. The first challenge is how the council will manage the different agendas between or among its members, because we have so many conflicting agendas within this council. We have the Southern Transitional Council, we have the Islah Party, we have Tariq, we have Al-Mu'tamar, we have other actually groups who have not a unified vision about the future of Yemen. So how the council will manage all these differences, I think, is a key issue. The second is how the council will deal with the Saudis and Emiratis, because we have seen huge mistrust between Hadi government and the Saudis and Emiratis on the other side. So are we going to see a different approach in dealing with this council where the Saudis and Emiratis give more support, but maintain a sort of sovereignty for the council? And the third point, and this is actually the most difficult one, which is how the council will deal with the Houthis, either in the scenario of conflict or the scenario of political compromises. Based on that, we can see this is, a good approach, or it can be a new model of failure, unfortunately.
Thank you, Ahmed, also for remembering us about missile and drone attacks by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia and also the United Arab Emirates territory at the beginning of 2022. And this helped me to enlarge a bit our vision to the Gulf with Sanam. I come to you. Since in 2015, the Yemen conflict began as an internal political dispute for power, for representation, resources, but the direct and indirect role of regional powers, so Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, has gradually grown, contributing also to change the nature of the conflict, and also, I could say, to produce new players on the ground. So after 7 years of war, how do you see the role of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE in Yemen? Which are their goals now, and how much political and military leverage they have gained or lost?
Thank you, Eleonora, and to ISPI for organizing this important panel. Pleasure to be here alongside Nadwa and Ahmed, who are the real Yemen experts. I just watched the Gulf external space, so happy to keep my comments focused on GCC actors and Iran. And to answer your question, Obviously, the environment has very much changed over the 7 years, and I think both Nadwa and Ahmad might be best placed to comment on the role of external actors in Yemen, which has been a sort of profound and long-standing facet of Yemen's history, and of course it's become exacerbated since 2015 and since the Saudi-led coalition formally engaged in this war. The war has been through very many phases and itinerations, and Ahmed, I think, very eloquently captured the different approaches of members of the coalition, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who have been the prominent faces of the coalition through this 7-year period. The UAE and Saudi, while working together at the outset of the war, have clearly different sort of agendas in the Yemen war. And I think this has been one of the big external obstacles. It's not limited just to these two countries. Obviously, the GCC as an entity has not been united in its objectives in Yemen. Each country has its own policy and strategy towards Yemen, which has also further obstructed dynamics on the ground. But focusing primarily on the UAE and Saudi, while the two coordinated initially at the outset of the war, the UAE's objectives were quite divergent. And at the outset of the war, of course, very, very much driven by the MBS-MBZ relationship, there did seem to be greater unity, but ultimately the UAE is more focused on its objectives of stemming the Muslim Brotherhood's reach inside Yemen, but also its ability to impact Emirati domestic politics, the Muslim Brotherhood and Islam in particular. This context is seen as a threat to Emirati's security interests. So that is one of the drivers of the UAE in this conflict. The second, of course, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are more closely aligned, of course, is to stem Iran's role, engagement, and support for the Houthis at the same time. So these divergences, particularly priorities with regards to Islam, have led the UAE over time to focus more on its own interests, developing, I think, quite effective proxy forces on the ground that have been more focused in the south. Leaving the northern battles in the north very much to Riyadh to manage and lead the military and strategic orientation in that regard. The shifts between the UAE and Saudi Arabia became more acute and more apparent, particularly as the UAE in 2019 recognized that its role in the war and its role more broadly in other regional conflicts brought greater scrutiny to Emirati politics in capitals in Europe, also in Washington, D.C. And the UAE, I think, also perhaps felt that its support for proxy groups on the ground in Yemen were adequate to protect its position, and that led to the Riyadh Agreement and the formal sort of Emirati withdrawal from its military position, and the re-engagement in 2022 that we just saw. And the direct attacks on Abu Dhabi and oil infrastructure in 2022 sort of reflect the ongoing Emirati engagement, but it has evolved through different phases. But 2022 sort of has re-injected a unification of Emirati and Saudi interests, which have brought us to today and brought us to the conference in Riyadh and this creation of a council that brings together all of these contending groups. So it remains to be seen if these contending groups can finally work together in opposing the Houthis, but also in aligning Emirati and Saudi objectives simultaneously. Just quickly on Iran and the sort of the Iranian element, which remains crucial. through this period. Iran's role in this crisis has increased as a consequence of the war. It began its outreach in Yemen in the 2000s and even in the 1990s, but it has definitely strengthened its relationship with the Houthis from 2009 going forward, providing military support, training, and equipment of the Houthis, and the relationship has strengthened as Iran, also through its relationship with Hezbollah, has provided capacity, training, financial support to the group as well. I think the relationship that Iran has with the Houthis is more of a train and equip relationship rather than a command and control relationship. And this is very much important to understand in how Iran manages its own proxy relationships throughout the Middle East, but particularly in this context. Iran doesn't have that command and control relationship. We have seen in the past the Houthis taking steps like the takeover of Sana'a, for example, that Iran opposed, and Iran doesn't pick up the phone and command in that way that is very much presented by Saudi Arabia in this context. But at the same time, of course, Iran has presence on the ground, IRGC presence, Quds Force presence on the ground. The numbers are not huge. I hear that they're 20 to 30 maximum. We have seen an exchange of ambassadors between the Houthis and Iran. Of course, Iran's ambassador died, and there hasn't been a formal replacement of Iran's diplomatic presence in the north at the same time. What I would say in the Iranian side of this story is that through this war period, the relationship, while it has grown, has probably in Tehran made political leaders see the value of this relationship. Iran has traditionally not seen Saudi Arabia as a strategic threat, but that threat perception has slightly shifted over time. And the relationship with the Houthis is of value because Iran is able to pressure Saudi Arabia through this proxy relationship.
Yes.
And missile and drone attacks have seen Iran demonstrate its ability to export lethal aid and export the testing of that lethal aid in other frontiers, and offer Iran at the same time plausible deniability in its own sort of pressure tactics and pursuit of regional instability. For example, in the 2019 September Abreb attacks, when Saudi oil facilities were attacked, and the Houthis accepted responsibility for that attack, even though much of the intelligence and analytical community think that those attacks came directly from Iran or potentially even from Iraq. So the value of the Houthi relationship, I think, has increased for Iran. And so the expectation that Iran will withdraw from that conflict, I think, should be sort of reconsidered and reevaluated. Perhaps there can be sort of a negotiated settlement where Iran agrees to terms, and in fact it has supported the ceasefire, for example, because the recognition of the Houthis as a legitimate political arbiter in Yemen is ultimately what Iran seeks, and through that relationship an opportunity to assert its influence and interest. So all of this to say that each of these parties have an agenda, and aligning those objectives over time will be just as important for the sustainability of this new council and for the sustainability of UN-led mediation towards peace.
Thank you, Saman, for this precise and rich trajectory of Gulf powers' role in Yemen since 2015. Nadwa, let's talk again about the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, to use the name of the political movement. The Houthis continue to hold most of Yemen's northwestern territory, including the capital, Sana'a. And this, of course, through a mix of coercion, local alliances, informal economic networks, and profiteering. In your view, what about the relationship now between the Houthis and the tribes in northern regions, the tribes who used to support Ali Abdullah Saleh and his regime? And do you think the Houthi leadership is now politically closer to Iran than it was in 2015? Salah rightly underlined the point of train and the keep relationship between Iran and the Houthis. I would ask to you, is there a tighter relationship than before also on ideology, in your view?
Yeah, the Houthis control North Yemen mainly through repression. They've established an extremely repressive system against their opponents, potential threats, and mainly the tribes. Because the Houthis see the tribes as a threat. The tribes have always enjoyed a great level of autonomy, but also a good relationship with the state. That was the case during Saleh, that was the case during Hadi. And the tribes protected their people from the potential repression of the state in the past. And so what the Houthis, and then the tribes in the past have played a really important role in overthrowing the imamate back in the 60s and even, a revolution before then against the imamate. So what the Houthis have done with the tribes, they have subjugated the tribes. They've done some co-optation, but what they did, they've isolated tribal leaders from their communities, from their people. They've actually assassinated over 40 tribal leaders since the beginning of the war. Many of these tribal leaders helped them capture cities and the capital city of Sana'a in the north. And they've appointed supervisors, and these supervisors they're part of the Houthi security system, and they have power over state institutions and over tribes. At the same time, they've been conducting massive indoctrination campaigns in tribal areas, mainly targeting the younger population, the youth, but also the children, brainwashing them with Houthi ideology, with Houthi political ideology. So over time, we will see the tribes, what the Houthis are trying to do, they're trying to dismantle the tribal system, and they will succeed eventually if this pattern continues, if the Houthis continue to rule these areas. And that will give them a steady supply of fighters from tribal areas and basically control over the population. On the second question, Houthis' relationship with Iran. Houthis' relationship with Iran has always been strong. Houthis are a manifestation of Iran's investment in Yemen over the past decades. So this relationship has been going on since the 80s. And yes, the relationship has strengthened during the war. Yes, because the war just provided that, environment where, where the Houthis became stronger militarily with the support of Iran, with Iranian commanders, Hezbollah commanders on the ground, helping Houthis, aiding them in planning and executed their military plan. But one of the arguments out there that the Houthis and Iran relationship became stronger because the Saudis intervened. Now that's quite misleading. Saudi-led coalition intervention has many negative consequences in Yemen. That's okay. Strengthening the relationship between the Houthis and Iran is not one of them. When the Houthis captured Sana'a, the first thing they did, they agreed with the Iranians to run 14 flights a week between Sana'a and Tehran. And I'm sure those planes wouldn't have, brought flowers from Iran. So yes, this war has solidified the relationship. Iran and the Houthis and I agree completely with Sanam, it's not a command and control sort of relationship, but it's also a strategic alliance and a political ideological, commitment. The Houthis and Iran share the same political ideology. It's rooted in religious myth, but they believe it. And so looking at the Iran-Houthi relationship from a pragmatic lens is a little misleading. There is some pragmatism, but there is also political ideology and strategic alliance that has always been there, that will always be there.
Thank you, Nadwa. You talked about the counterproductive effect of the Saudi-led intervention in strengthening the alliance between the Houthis and Iran. And the paradox, in my view, is that the Houthis now present themselves as a national player to defend the nation against what they call the aggression of Saudi Arabia against the Yemenis. And this is a paradox, since the Houthis are a movement, a political and military movement of the upper north of Yemen, and they don't represent the whole Zaidi Shia community, right? So this is another effect, indirect effect of this conflict. Ahmed, let's move to the south, since Yemen is really a varied, a complex country, and popular protests have reemerged in Yemen, especially in southern regions. Yemen is often demonstrated against inflation, which is a problem in the whole country, but also in the south: fuel, cooking gas shortages, the lack of welfare services, and the intermittent public salaries, and so on. What's interesting for me is that these protests are also erupting in the urban centers, in the areas which are held de facto by the secessionist Southern Transitional Council, Aden, Mukalla, in Hadramaut. So not only in the areas directly controlled by the internationally recognized government. Do you think the Southern Transitional Council has been failing in local governance? And do you see the emergence of other new political military players in southern regions, maybe trying to capitalize on economic discontent or political realignments?
Yes, we need actually to highlight the huge collapse of the governmental institutions in the south, which is surrounding by divisions and not clear image about who should rule and govern and provide services to all these areas. We have seen the Riyadh Agreement as an attempt to bring some sort of reforms for the institutions, or at least arrangements to say, yeah, now we have some sort of understanding between the governmental, institutions or Hadi linked leaders to work together with the STC leaders. But unfortunately, we didn't see any tangible results out of this agreement. And that's why we are seeing today the Presidential Council. But again, when it comes to discontent coming out of this of this collapse of the public services, it was visible in many areas, and we have seen some certain movements actually are benefiting from this kind of resettlement in order to consolidate their agendas in the country. Perhaps this is actually another level of why some certain movements will, depressed about, even the alternatives and the Southern Transitional Council move, which was in 2019 when it announced the self-administration, was not a solution for fixing all these issues. But as I mentioned, and when you have a state of war, you can expect all this kind of collapse and problems. And this is, the normal dynamic of the conflict. Yes, in the South, they don't have like a very present confrontations, but they have the consequences of the conflict in the country. I need also to highlight another important point. People, when they hear about protest and demonstration in the South, they think that maybe the situation in the north is much better. No, on the contrary, actually, the situation in the north is worse than the south. In the south, you have margin to speak up, margin to protest, margin to demonstrate, to say that, yeah, I'm suffering from XYZ. But in the north, where the Houthis are controlling every single thing in the country, they don't allow anyone to speak up. Even on social media, we have seen actually the Houthis arrested so many social media activists because they speak up. They talked about, collapse in some public services or the group behaviors in different aspects. And to look at the situation in the north, as Nadwa mentioned, people actually have not been receiving their salaries for around 5 years. If we are talking about 5 hours of electricity in Aden or Hadramaut, we are talking about 0 electricity in Sana'a, for example. And I'm not trying to beautify the governmental side, but to say that, this is actually the dynamics when you have monopoly of force and you have just one group controlling everything, you can hear nothing. But on the other side, this is kind of divisions, and this is another problems that we are seeing given the different context. And one more thing, and I will end here, is the resettlement of people. People in the south think that the war is over, and we need. What's the next? We need the public services. We need, to normalize with the post-conflict time and to see some sort of improvements in our daily life. And this is unfortunately something elusive unless we resolve, the national problem and to come up with a comprehensive solution. And this seems to be, a bit far until now.
Thank you, Ahmed. I was thinking, listening at your reflection to the role of international media and lack or problems to access for international media in Yemen, especially in the northern Houthi-held areas. And this is also why I think this is an underreported conflict in the MENA region. Sanam, I would like to contextualize Yemen current events in evolving regional and international balances. Since the American partnerships with Saudi Arabia and the UAE are experiencing a troubled phase. The US is no longer perceived as a strongly engaged security provider. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine put these partnerships under further pressure due to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi's economic ties with Moscow, which are relevant, although not strategic, as the Gulf's ties with China, for instance. So given this context, do you think is it possible to insulate Yemen from increasing political tensions between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the United States? And can the European Union play a role in bridging the gap between Washington and Gulf capitals in this troubled moment?
Thank you. I think that's a webinar in itself, but I'll try to get as much in a few minutes.
You can use one of my suggestions within this answer.
I do think, yes, you've correctly, I think, through your comments, characterized that the regional order in the Middle East is no doubt shifting, and it's moving from more US-dominated security order to a multipolar one. And we have been witnessing this shift for well over a decade now. It's a shift that has been seeing divisions and frustrations since even before the Arab Spring, but I think that most of the analytical community points to the Arab Spring as one of the main catalyzers. But I think we can also point to the signing of the Iran nuclear agreement in 2015, the lack of American protection for Gulf security in 2019 that I referenced earlier, and the Ableb attacks. And again, the U.S. lack of response or not adequate enough response when its partner, the UAE, was attacked in January of 2022. So there are a number of events that have thread this frustration together, and it's driven by U.S. objectives to pivot, not to draw down, but the pivot is perceived to be a drawdown. And so these gaps in perceptions are very much exposing what I see as a festering wound of priorities and differences, divergent approaches between Washington and its traditional Gulf partners. Biden has very much tried to rebalance or reset the relationship, and much to the frustration of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, he has also pursued negotiations with Iran to revive the JCPOA. And both countries were very frustrated when the new administration in 2021 removed the foreign terrorist designation from the Houthis as well. So it's a mix of issues coming together and that is being exacerbated over Gulf positions with regards to the war in Ukraine. I do at the same time, though, I mean, what we're watching and what we're witnessing is going to continue to be gradual because we don't know how this war is going to end. And I think that Gulf states are very much hedging, like most Middle Eastern players, because they do very clearly see a shift in U.S. priorities. And at the same time, they have to protect their perceived security interests and their national interests. And the Gulf position, which again isn't unified, and here I'm specifically referring to the UAE and Saudi, could very much shift as a new structure and basis of the relationship could be, and I think will be, negotiated with Washington. The Gulf states are trying to make their presence known and understood, and would like to receive value and respect from Washington. This is no longer a command and control relationship either. And we're watching these bumps play out quite awkwardly as Gulf states are rightly demonstrating sovereignty and agency over their national interests. But at the same time, the U.S. and the Biden administration has been heavily committed to supporting a drawdown and end an arrival of a peace settlement in Yemen. They have appointed Tim Lenderking as the U.S. envoy, and he has spent a considerable amount of time in Yemen, in the Gulf, trying to facilitate consensus and support the UN process as well. So I think that definitely there can be compartmentalization of these differences as we're seeing them. Yes, the Saudis are very much leading the talks underway right now in Riyadh, and the U.S. is there, the U.S. is involved, but they are not at front and center of these negotiations, as I understand it. They were to hear of Hadi's removal after it had happened rather than being present when it happened. So that, little anecdote can show you some of the differences, the acute differences that are underway. But I very much suspect that things will settle over time and the relationships will be supported. The European Union has developed its own strategy to the Gulf, and I think that's very much should be used to guide the EU's engagement on Yemen and the Gulf. The Gulf requires Gulf stability, Gulf unity is very much still needed. I think it's going to, this is a first step with regards to the talks in Riyadh, but it's important to build on the Al-Ula agreement. all is not yet resolved in that context. And I think the EU does have an important role to play as an interlocutor in maintaining its own relationships with GCC actors and in supporting the direction of peace in Yemen simultaneously. And at the same time, trying to push the JCPOA process over the line. So there's a lot of work to be done. There are strained capacities everywhere globally. And so greater coordination between Europe, the EU, and the United States, I think, is urgently needed.
Thank you, Sanam. Yes, it's also in the U.S. Gulf relations, it's also a matter of perception, not only of action. And I feel that the Yemen conflict in this year has contributed a lot to widen the perception of a gap between Gulf monarchies, capitals, and Washington. I would open the floor now to some questions arrived from our public. Thank you very much for sending your question. There's an interesting one about the role of Oman in the conflict, which is the role of Oman as a neutral GCC actor in the conflict. Is Muscat playing any kind of mediation in Yemen? I would say that usually Oman is a neutral country, but it has also its national interest with regard to the border, the Yemeni-Omani border, and it has also an open channel of communication with the Houthis, which I think is still functioning. Ahmed, would you like to give us 2 minutes of insights on Oman now in the conflict mediation?
Just before answering this question, I need just to add a very specific point or quick point about what Sanam mentioned. I totally agree with her, and I just need to add that there's also a shift within the international community position towards the situation in Yemen, because as a consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are seeing some sort of interest in stabilizing the areas where the energy market is there, and from here we can understand why we need more stability in these areas. We don't need more attacks against Saudi or Emirati facilities in the future during the this conflict. So this is the point related to the regional aspect and international aspect as well. For Oman, I think, we always say Oman is the icon of neutrality, but when it comes to Yemen, I think they have their own security, let's say, interests, because they don't want to see any sort of, regional forces close to their borders. And we have seen actually some sort of actions coming from Oman towards the Saudi presence in Al-Maghrib. But again, having Oman in this position and having good relationship with the Houthis, to some extent, it played significant role in orchestrated the ceasefire for 2 months that we are witnessing nowadays. And the question is, this rule of Oman can be, further invested to take the ceasefire to a next phase and talk about, I'm referring to political compromises with the Houthis and the other parties as well. This is actually the key point that we so many people are expecting from Oman to play in the future.
Thank you, Ahmed. Nadwa, just a suggestion from you. From a military perspective, do you think is there a viable exit strategy for Saudi Arabia from the conflict, as the Houthis have stepped up attacks with missiles, with drones against the kingdom, and this exit strategy could be, in your view, this new presidential council?
So Saudis are not safe as long as the Houthis are dominant in Yemen. And Yemen is not safe, and the region is not safe as long as the Houthis are dominant in Yemen. The Saudis want the border attack to stop, and I think they have gotten to a point where, for a while now, the Saudis do want to exit Yemen. They want to make a deal with the Houthis, but they're also aware of the risk involved if they just withdraw. Uniting the anti-Houthi forces is definitely a positive step. And if the Saudis were to have a viable and sustainable exit strategy, the anti-Houthi forces need to come together and push the Houthis militarily to a point where the Houthis feel weak enough to accept a compromise and a power share with others where they're not the dominant force, where they're just one of other actors. Without that, I'm afraid the Houthis will continue to be a threat. If the Saudis agree with the Houthis to stop the cross-border attacks in return for the Saudis to withdraw completely from Yemen, then this cross-border attack will stop for a while. The Houthis will swallow the entire country, and then they'll continue to threat Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget that the Houthis' goal, and this is rooted in their political ideology, is to liberate Mecca and Jerusalem. And that's not propaganda. That is their plan. That is their strategy, along with Iran and Iran proxies in the region. Again, uniting the anti-Houthi forces is a good step, but it's really hard to read what the Saudis are planning next. One day they want to push militarily, another day, and it's been a while that they're really talking about a political settlement and a peaceful end to the conflict. But how can you end the conflict peacefully when there's a group like the Houthis that is not accepting another party, that, like you said, they see themselves as the only representatives of Yemenis, and they basically, they cast other forces, including this entire presidential council, which they call, recycle of Saudi mercenaries. So it's up to the Saudis to decide what they want to do next.
Thank you, Nadwa. You rightly mentioned how much this conflict, the Yemen conflict, is also a border dispute between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, a conflict which is also fought along the border. And as Ahmed remembered before, there's also a maritime side, maritime implications of this conflict. Sanam, I have 1 minute short question for you to conclude our conversation. In case the negotiations on the JCPOA should fail, do you think Iran will increase irregular warfare attacks against Saudi, Emirati, maybe Israeli targets also in the Red Sea? I think to commercial vessels, for instance, in coordination with the Houthis in Yemen, can be a feasible scenario for you?
Yes, very short answer. A strong yes. Oh. We've seen Iran demonstrate its resistance strategy since May of 2019. The good news is that we know what Iran's resistance strategy looks like. There'll be nuclear focused resistance, but there will be regional resistance as well. And Iran will transfer, as it did in 2019, again, instability to the region in order to remind everyone, in case we've forgotten, its destabilizing power and its relations with so many different divergent groups throughout the region. So I very much expect it to step up, and it will be on the borders of Israel. We'll expect escalation in Iraq, of course, in Yemen and in the Arabian Peninsula, and on the high seas and in cyberspace. So that is definitely going to be in the cards.
Okay, it's not of good omen for maritime security and also energy stability in this troubled scenario. Unfortunately, we have no more time and we must close our conversation. I apologize with the public for the questions which were not answered, but a warm welcome to all our public for attending this webinar. And thank you to our guests for their time and for sharing ideas with us. It was really a rich conversation as expected. So thank you to Nadwa Al-Dawzari, to Ahmed Naji, and to Sanam Vakil. ISPMED events continue soon, and let's stay with us. Goodbye.